a couple more minutes as people shuffle in. And as we do, I would ask you to go and see Teresa over at the Burning Books stand. You can purchase today's selection or any other selection, as I have done. Burning Books is a wonderful bookshop here in town, and this is our first time having them here selling books. So we still have a couple minutes. Shop, mingle, and then we'll get started.
Hi, how are you? What's your name? I heard all about you. I'm very touchy.
Sorry. It's all right. You can just say I'm executive director. So how long did you stay last night?
I've been doing these for 20 years, so
This one looks great.
I know instinctively when to leave. Get your food.
You didn't say anything.
Well, that's
I was waiting. Yeah, and then I said, hi.
you always leave right before the publisher starts. That's my.
I don't think we spoke.
That's my point. Is I never spend more than 30, 40 minutes. If you spend much longer, especially if there's an open bar, people, get drunk. Well, let's go ahead and get started. If everybody can take their seats. It's just a couple minutes after 12. My name is Frank Hausch. I have the honor of being the chairman of the Buffalo and Erie County System Board of Trustees, and this is our third year of the Chairman's Book Club. As we did last year, we turned this over to Karen King, who, for all of you who don't know her, is the executive director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. Last year we talked about a wonderful book, All the Single Ladies, and this year she has chosen another wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit, Men Explain Things to Me. I am about to turn it over to Karen, and I would simply note that our own Dr. Rhonda Ricks, who was to be one of the panelists today, sends her regrets. She's a member of the board and very much wanted to be here today to talk about this book with all of you. Unfortunately, she came down with an illness that it's a strong illness, otherwise it wouldn't have kept Dr. Ricks from being here with you. I want to assure you of that. So my apologies on her behalf. The final thing I will say before we get started is the next installment of the Chairman's Book Club. We'll be reading Hillbilly Elegy, and we have some flyers here. Hillbilly Elegy was chosen not just because it's an interesting and wonderful selection. It also happens to be the most checked out nonfiction book in the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system. So this is a book that it spoke strongly to the people in our system, and I will tell you, across the libraries across the United States. So we don't have panelists yet. We're going to have a wonderful panel, I have no doubt. And this is this is continuing on the theme of discussing key issues in our society through good books. So without further ado, I am going to sit down and turn this over to Karen King, our own Erie County Executive Director on the Commission on the Status of Women.
Am I supposed to take that microphone?
You can do whatever you want. Especially today, I'm going to sit down and say nothing.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the Women's History Month book selection. It's nice to see everyone braved the snow. Regrettably, it's still snowing. So, first of all, I would like to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Sarah Vecchio. Sarah is the Executive Director of the Women's Business Center at Canisius College. Thank you, Anne. Since November 2013. The center provides education combined with peer and mentor support to empower women business owners to grow their businesses to the level of success they desire. Sarah previously served as Director of Development for the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Northtowns and as a fundraiser for Niagara University. She holds an MS degree from Damon College in Executive Leadership and Change and a BA in Communication Studies from Niagara. Welcome, Sarah. And then to the left of Sarah is Hilary Vandenberg. She's a PhD candidate in Global and Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University at Buffalo. Her research examines how the judicial system discursively excludes particular people from justice through the management of victimhood narratives. Hilary does community advocacy for those who experience sexual assault, and she also is an intern with the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. Welcome, ladies. So is this, everyone can hear me? I don't want to be blaring. So this year's selection, Rebecca Solnit's Men Explain Things to Me, first appeared as an essay in 2008 on the online site Tom Dispatch. Solnit states it spread quickly and has never stopped going around, being reposted and shared and commented upon. It circulated like nothing else I've done. It struck a chord and a nerve. In 2014, Haymarket Books published the book version, which included the original 2008 essay, as well as a collection of essays written between 2008 and 2014, entitled Men Explain Things to Me. 3 years before the Women's March and the Me Too and Time's Up movements had taken hold. Please share with all of us your overarching thoughts on Men Explain Things to Me. Sarah, would you like to start?
So, first of all, I think it's fascinating, and I wonder if you do too, when you read something that seems extremely timely and pertinent to right now, only to find out that it was written years ago. How does that happen that we're having the exact same conversation? Which is interesting to me, a woman of a young boy going through school right now who, when I was his age, absolutely hated history. Thought it was so boring. I just hated to talk about history and learn about history. But now as an adult, as a woman experiencing all that we're going through, and as a mother trying to teach her son all the right ways to be a good human being, it's interesting to know how much we should learn about history so that we don't keep repeating it, or at least we learn from it, and we grow from it, and we do something different. So that's one of my initial thoughts. And then my second initial thought was, I came to Karen and I said, why did you make me read this book? Honestly, I'd only gone 50 pages in and I stopped for a long period of time. And just out of show of hands, how many of you read this book already? Okay, so the beginning is tough, right? The beginning is tough to read, even for a woman like me who has done a lot of gender-orientated reading throughout my entire career. Was noted in literature class in undergraduate about how I was a budding feminist at that time, and during my MS degree did research on leadership characteristics in women, and has ever since been an interest of mine. So I feel like I've read a lot and know a lot about women's issues and where we are today, and still I read these things and all I can think of is I'm not surprised, but I'm completely shocked. You know what I mean? It's not surprising because you know of it, if you read of it, if you learn of it, but then the numbers, the stories are shocking, and it's tough to shake. So I got 50 pages in and I stopped and I said, when are we gonna stop talking about these torturous statistics? because it's hard. It's hard even when you know about it. It's hard to just keep, you know, really making yourself aware. But those were my two initial thoughts. She said to me at the time, keep reading, it's very empowering. I kept reading, like, when is it going to become empowering? And I really think the truth to that is this conversation. This is when it becomes empowering. I don't really think I got to the end of the last page and I said, really, Karen King, when did it become empowering? I read the whole book. But I think this is this next step, right? So all of the intelligent people that read the book and say, where do we go from here? How do we continue conversation, make something change? That's where the empowerment comes in. So those are my initial thoughts.
Well, those are very similar to my initial thoughts. So just a little bit of background on my research. So I look at where Solnit looks at some of the more spectacular cases. I look at some of the more mundane cases that have taken place in New York State over the past 40 years in my research. And so for me, it was not maybe quite as difficult to read it because that's what I'm reading all day, every day. And my office hours, I teach part-time at UB, so my office hours are filled with students coming to talk to me about their sexual assault stories and how they can access resources. And so I think, like, and also my career as a doctorate student has been full of mansplaining, even in gender courses. And so for me, this book is deeply personal and also deeply timely. I see in Solnit's work kind of the precursor to the movements that we're having now and the conversations that we're having now. And so I think just in her work on the way women's voices have been erased in the Grandmother Spider essay and stuff is particularly poignant now when we think about not just the way that white wealthy celebrities' voices have been erased and their experiences erased, but how women of color, women working in factories, women who are working class and sex workers, right, where their voices are erased and sometimes not part of this conversation. And so I think that this is something where there's room to grow. And so I think that this is a good catalyst for thinking through how voices get erased and how we can shed light on those voices.
Thank you, Hilary.
Can I just ask real quick? Are we going to
Yes.
at the end, but not in the middle? Okay.
So thank you both for sharing your thoughts. And as you state, I think there's some key themes that emerge from her writing. And of course, the number one women being silenced is the reoccurring theme that she illustrates over and over again. And then the silence through apparent lack of credibility as human beings, not being taken seriously, and through verbal threats and physical acts of violence. And I would imagine that's why it's a tough read. It's troubling even though we know this, but when you see it on the written page, it takes on a whole new life. So on page 14, Solnit writes, "The battle for women to be treated like human beings with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of involvement in cultural and political arenas continues. And it is sometimes a pretty grim battle." She goes on to say, "I surprised myself when I wrote the essay, which began with an amusing incident and ended up with rape and murder. That made clear to me the continuum that stretches from minor social misery to violent silencing and violent death, and I think we would understand misogyny and violence against women even better if we looked at the abuse of power as a whole rather than treating domestic violence separately from rape and murder and harassment and intimidation. Online and at home and in the workplace and in the streets, seen together, the pattern is clear. Having the right to show up and speak are basic to survival, to dignity, and to liberty. I'm grateful that after an early life of being silent, sometimes violently, I grew up to have a voice, circumstances that will always bind me to the rights of the voiceless." What do you think about that? About it being a grim battle and this whole idea of this continued assault on silencing women?
Well, for me, and hopefully I'm not going to get too academic on everybody, but this is just really showed the influence of the great radical feminist Catherine McKinnon in her essay, "Are Women Human?", where she argues that based on like the legal status that we apply to men, but we don't apply to women, based on men's humanity, that women are not in fact human, right? Because they're not treated that way as a legal subject. And so I think that Solnit is really trying to push this idea beyond just the legal setting, right? How do we have cultural humanity? How do we have social humanity? How are we recognized by other humans as being human, right? And I think that that's a place where women continue to lag behind, although we've definitely seen some improvements.
Yeah, the silencing thing, it's tough for me to really wrap my brain around. I have so many different thoughts and experiences about that. You know, I happen to be a loud woman, just actually in voice. If you know me, I speak quite loudly, and not only that, I'm a very passionate individual, so I can get loud quickly because I'm excited about something. So I'm accustomed to, throughout my entire life, people kind of backing up a little bit when Sarah starts talking. What is she getting on about? But this is the kind of topic, and I think it happens in numerous topics, but definitely this one for me, where the more you educate yourself, the more you understand the problems. And the more it's tough to silence yourself, but at the same time, the more you talk about it, the more you get rolled eyes and people wanting to back off from the conversation. So it's troubling for me, the silencing thing, because as I was reading it, I start to realize how incredibly opinionated I am on this topic, how much education I've had on the topic and experiences I had on the topic, yet how little I speak to it on my Facebook page or in my personal conversations. I speak it in my professional conversations all the time, but out of the concern that people are going to start rolling their eyes or backing away because Sarah's starting to talk about another topic she's passionate about, is something that has silenced me, you know, and it was an interesting thought process because, you know, you start to feel like nobody's listening anymore, so you just stop talking. And I wonder how many of us that are opinionated, educated on the topic, and passionate on the topic have stopped through the years because you realize nobody's listening anymore. So then there's two types of people, right? Those that aren't educated or passionate about the topic, so they're not talking about it, and those who are extremely passionate and might have stopped because they feel like nobody's listening anymore. So then how many people does that leave still talking about the topic and trying to further the agenda? So that's something that, you know, started to occur to me when I was reading it, and I realized maybe it's time that I started talking about it. You know, I actually didn't put on my personal Facebook page that I was doing this presentation today, and it occurred to me, you know, because everybody else would probably go, oh, there she goes again, talking about her feminist talk, you know. And the number of people, and that's a hot button for me, the word feminism. How many of you have talked about that in your personal lives? But to still hear the amount of people that don't understand what feminism actually is, and still have that thought process or those visual images that were put out in what, the 70s or 80s about lesbian brutes, those are what feminists are. It's not an individual, it's not a man, it's not a woman who just simply wants equality and equal rights for herself, but it's some, you know, exaggerated figure that is pushing a far agenda. Yeah, absolutely. No. It's a casual back and forth, whatever.
Yeah, so like one thing that I was thinking about, or that struck me about the last line of the section that Karen read for us, is that how her voicelessness kind of gave way to her voice, and then that ties her to other people who are voiceless. And I think that that's something that's really important, is to amplify the voices of the voiceless. And so one thing it reminded me of when I was reading it was something from the Washington Post a couple years ago that talked about amplification in the Obama White House, where even though women were a third or half of the advisors, they were seldom getting to speak in the meetings. And then when they were speaking, they were ignored, and then a male colleague would take credit for their idea a few minutes later. And so what they did was devise a strategy called amplification, where the women would just repeat each other's ideas over and over again, and often talking over the men to get that idea across and citing its original, the person that generated the idea, so that way she would get credit. And so I think that that's something especially women in positions of privilege can do to amplify other women's voices or other people that don't identify as a woman but remain marginalized nonetheless.
Thank you both. Just a couple thoughts. When you talk about your work life and your private life, your personal Facebook and your career, I think we have a tendency to create these bifurcations, and I really think it's, like Solnit says, it's a continuum. Sure, we conduct ourselves one way in the business sector and at home, but I don't really think those divisions are real. I think they're constructed, and I think they do carry over into our professional lives. Otherwise, we wouldn't find ourselves in this situation, right? And what I find interesting is this whole idea of being silenced is a continuum, because you might not feel that you're silenced individually, because I too, grew up with a big mouth and my mother telling me, you're bossy, you're like a Russian tank, you just come storming in. But of course, I've experienced being silenced my entire life and grew acutely aware of it as I got older, that there's a time and place to say certain things and keep your mouth shut. And it wasn't my nature, but it was enforced culturally. So I knew, even at a tender age, there must be something bigger operating here. I couldn't quite say it's institutionalized oppression. I hadn't learned that term yet, but I felt like, something's not right. So there used to be an expression in this early days of the second wave feminist movement, the personal is political. So our personal lives are politicized and around these larger structures, and sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes we're not. But it does play out, and it's so interesting that you bring out the amplification story, because I remember reading that, and I think I might have even posted it on our Commission Facebook page. It's a great tactic, and I think these are survival skills women have learned over the years, but it's a great tactic to reinforce women's accomplishments among ourselves, in meetings especially. And I've noticed when that's happened to me, and I've felt a really great sense of appreciation when women colleagues or colleagues have done that, but it's a tactic that we've had to develop.
I just want to say another thing that I've recognized, I think a lot comes through with the Me Too scenario and sexual assault, and the very common lack of understanding from men, but you always hear, why did she wait so long to come out and tell her story? Or why now are so many women coming out that there's this Me Too scenario? Why are they jumping in? And I think, my personal story that I was just mentioning about personal versus private, I think we as a gender tend to fight for the underdog more so than we do ourselves on a regular basis. Myself, always been in nonprofit leadership. It's because I found at a young age that I liked using my loud voice, my power of influence, for others who didn't have a loud voice. So I worked in fundraising for children and for finding scholarships for those that were impoverished and couldn't afford the education they were going for, and then for women business owners. So when I speak loudly in advocacy for women in my professional life, it's because I feel like I've been given the okay to do so. By holding the position that I hold, I am able to speak as loudly and as often about fighting for women's rights and advocacy for equality for women in our community, because that's what I'm employed to do. That's what people have found as a specialty in me, and I'm able to. In my personal life, they've known me for who knows how many years and heard it, and they start. But it's time, I think the book was a reminder to me, just because people gloss over it doesn't mean you stop talking about it. Maybe those people that are glossing over it or rolling their eyes still don't get it, and that's why they're doing it. So that was just, about the Me Too, it was my tie. I think a lot of the women that are jumping into this hashtag may not necessarily be doing so just because they now feel like it's time to fight for their story, but because they feel like it's time to fight for us all.
Ooh, there's a lot there. And stuff, but so for me, I don't have that issue. My Facebook page is littered with feminism and very little about my day-to-day reality. And I am a person that grew up in a very conservative background, and so I've lost about 150 Facebook friends over the years from posting things on my Facebook. which is fine because I don't talk to those people anyways in my real life, so I don't need to talk to them online and stuff. But I think that like my deeply like personal experiences with sexual violence and helping people and listening to people with their stories of sexual violence, like it's not possible to delineate between the public and the private anymore, right? Like much like Karen was saying, and that like, you know, our private lives are littered with violence as much as our public lives are. And sometimes it's the violence on the low-key end of the spectrum of minor harassment, catcalling, right? And sometimes it's, you know, the very far end of the spectrum of being murdered for turning down a man, right? And so, yeah, I just don't think we really have that luxury of thinking about the private, like thinking about our homes as a safe space, because for so many of us it hasn't been a safe space. And, you know, it makes it that much harder to voice publicly what you can't voice privately. And I think that one of the things I appreciate about Solnit's work is her emphasis on like shifting standards of credibility, and where women gain their credibility in numbers, right? Like nobody would have believed Lupita Nyong'o had that experience with Harvey Weinstein if it weren't for already dozens of other women having come forward, right? But then on the flip side of that, when women come forward in such huge numbers, that's equally difficult to believe for so many people, right? And so then you have self-proclaimed feminists like Katie Roiphe, where she talks about, his name is escaping me, but the conservative columnist talking about rape hysteria, right? Where like we're overinflating the rates of campus sexual assault just because it's something that we're starting to talk about and stuff. So like women are caught in this double bind of, you know, you got to have enough people to where you're believed, but you can't have so many people that we have to think about this as an institutional problem.
Thank you, Hilary. That's a perfect segue to this next section, talking about the relevance of feminism and what it does for us. Solnit states, "We have so much further to go, but looking back at how far we've come can be encouraging. Domestic violence was mostly invisible and unpunished until a heroic effort by feminists to out it and crack down on it a few decades ago. Though it is now generates a significant percentage of the calls to police enforcement and has been crummy in most places, but the ideas that a husband has the right to beat his wife and that it's a private matter are not returning anytime soon. The genies are not going back into their bottles. And this is really how revolution works. Revolutions are first of all ideas." So my question is, are we experiencing a revolution right now?
Man, I hope so. Woman, I hope so. You know, it's interesting, go back to my original comment about history. It's interesting how old you could feel when you're around young people, right? Like anybody else with me there, you talk about college students, and I know they were saying the millennials are so engaged right now politically, and it's great, but it was frustrating for me around the election time to know how many people were uneducated on how recently we've established the rights we've established. And how, you know, still thinking about women, you know, going back to my career and helping women business owners, you know, how recently it's been since women can get a business loan without needing a man to sign it. Again, it's only been a couple of decades. And so it's mind-boggling at some point that that's the case. But on the other hand, if you wanted to look at the positive side of it, then that's progress, right? We've made progress. I've always been told by every single person from personal to professional life that I want to run before I walk. You know, baby steps are really hard for me to swallow. Why are we still taking baby steps? So I've had lots of conversations with friends of mine, especially, in the circle that we have, a lot of other directors of women's organizations in the area. We have this Women's Action Coalition, and some of them, you know, become friends, and we talk, and you know, on the sidelines, what do you think about this whole Me Too movement? what do you think about this uproar after Clinton didn't get, to get our own individual from different perspectives, political and business and just feminist. And the Me Too was originally, if you were talking about it day by day, when it first started, it was sad. It was hard. It's part of those statistics in the beginning that you didn't want to read about. You're not surprised, but you're completely shocked. And then it became exciting. It became exciting when the first case came out that, it wasn't Harvey Weinstein, was it? Was it first?
I think it was.
Was it Harvey Weinstein?
So it came out in the New York Times, investigative journalism into his conduct.
When widely known males started to be held accountable, it is the first time that I can recollect in my lifetime a man of substantial awareness in the community being actually followed by the women's voices as being a perpetrator. And I can't tell you how frustrated I was. If we think about historically, Michael Jackson to this day is my all-time favorite musician. And when Cosby's case came out, right? I can't remember. How many women did it come out were accusing him?
About 92, I think.
Not 92. So when that came out, and it was just increasing, and I was talking to people because I grew up on Cosby. I grew up watching that show, and in a wonderful family where we sat down and watched TV together. Gone are the days where those kinds of shows exist that you can watch with your children. But Cosby was that show. I watched it with my parents. Growing Pains, Family Ties. We could sit down and watch, remember primetime TV? You could sit down as a family and watch good family shows. And when that came out, I said, no way, not Cosby. And then 10 women, then 20 women. Holy crap, it's true.
So let me jump in here, Sarah. The question, do you think we are in a revolution right now?
I think with this being the first time that we are changing the story, the narrative is not that the women, what I was getting to is at that time I heard people telling me they want his money.
Hilary, how about you? You must have an opinion about this. So do you think we're in a revolution?
I think we are in the potential for a revolution. So we've had fierce anti-rape movements before, we've had fierce anti-harassment movements before that have kind of fittered out or been subsumed under other movements, or we've kind of taken less radical strategies to deal with it and stuff. So like, I'm hopeful, but I'm also not counting my chickens before they're hatched.
Okay.
Well, even Harvey Weinstein.
Okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to hold this question because I want to pose it to the group here, because I think it's a really important point in terms of what Somit says is revolutions essentially start as ideas. So just quickly to wrap things up before we bring it out to the larger audience, one last passage I want to read. The new feminism is making the problems visible. Did I just read this part? No, I didn't. Sorry, pardon me. The new feminism is making the problems visible in new ways. Perhaps in ways that are only possible now that so much has changed. A study of rape in Asia drew alarming conclusions about its widespread nature, but also introduced the term sexual entitlement to explain why so much of it takes place. The report's author, Dr. Emma Hulu, said they believed they had a right to have sex with a woman regardless of consent. In other words, she had no rights. Where did they learn that? So, thoughts on that? I mean, just to wrap it up before we bring it out to the audience, I guess what she's really speaking to is this larger culture of misogyny and institutionalized forms of misogyny and patriarchy. So they clearly are still present. So and I think you probably would agree with that. So if that's the case, are movements like Me Too and Time's Up, are they paving the way for the next revolution?
I'm going to just jump back quickly about the revolution that I think is also really exciting. Again, going back to my career with business, we are often talking about women and minorities. So we need to have greater equality for business owners and women and minorities. The statistics are staggering. But what I really love that this Me Too revolution, as you call it, I would call it, is happening is that we're not just talking about women. We're talking about minorities. We're talking about children. We're talking about equality, and I think that's a different narrative also. It started with our Me Too campaign. It started with feminism, but it's really, I think it's taking a different direction now, protecting the children with the gun rights, and the minority with the celebrity, changing the narrative after the Me Too to the equal rights for the minorities and their pay. I think that's exciting. To talk about equality across the board is an exciting narrative switch and a revolution, I believe.
I mean, patriarchy itself is just an idea too, right? But it's an idea that's been solidified and made powerful in our society, right? And so feminists have always brought ideas to contest that, right? And to denaturalize it, right? Because it is just an idea, and it's somehow the way that we've all collectively decided to function and historically decided to function in that way. And so this could potentially be a new discourse, right? A new idea for how the world should be organized, for how gender relations should be organized. And so, I think we kind of come up against patriarchy as this like monumental thing, but really it's just a bunch of small things that work together. And so this is one area where it's a small thing that we can push back on and contest the power of that narrative, contest the power of that idea. Powerful
Nonetheless, right? And it almost intractable because it's been entrenched in our culture for so long that we become so accepting of it. But yes, it is an idea that has to be challenged, but it's an idea that's very powerful. So I think what's interesting about all of the social movements that are happening right now, they're the exact opposite of being silenced, right? They're saying no, silent, no more. So I think that the book certainly, I don't know if I'd say a prophecy, but certainly laying the groundwork for what we see right now happening in our larger world. And I want to be encouraged by it, and I want to believe that it's a revolution. But revolutions take time, especially when you want to dismantle systems that have been institutionalized for so long. So with that, I want to be mindful of time, and I want to bring the discussion to the larger group and hear some of your thoughts on this idea of are we experiencing a revolution right now?
So I just finished the book this morning before getting to the talk here, and to me it is a very powerful book, and like you said, initially when I started I was just angry. I was discussing it with some friends when I just read the book halfway. I was just angry about everything. But at the end of it, yes, we are at a beginning of a revolution. But to me, I feel I want to take each one of these books and not only just read it myself, but give it to my husband, give it to my son, and make sure that they read it too, because they have to be a part of this revolution. It's not going to happen unless we involve both the genders.
I'm actually curious if it's revolution or evolution. It ended the conversation with male roles too, and we've talked about that in our Women's Action Coalition. Not that I want to switch the conversation away from women, but we've evolved as a family, as a society, and those roles are man and women's, and there are a lot of good men out there that have a hard time finding their place in all of this too. So I wonder if it's evolution of our society and evolution of our family life.
Can I make a comment?
It's revolution. Yes, Frank, and then we're going back to the larger audience.
I'm sorry, I don't want to take anybody's time, but just this reminds me so much of the very first of these that we did. It was Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, and it was a discussion of the same sort of having been silenced, having been marginalized of African Americans. As a heterosexual white man from Kansas with blonde hair and blue eyes who's an attorney and worked in corporations, I can tell you that this suspicion that you have that this culture is encouraged, it's overt. I've been talking to managing partners. That's regarded as one of the perks. Having access to young women is regarded as a perk, just like your parking and your health care and your bonuses. That's one of the things that they talk about. So if you suspect that this is unspoken, it's not. It is a spoken understanding of white supremacy and powerfulness over other people and their bodies. And it has to be challenged at every possible opportunity. Exactly in the same way that the notion that African Americans could be lynched for the slightest provocation and be protected by the system, this is on that same spectrum. It has to be challenged at every possible turn. So it made sense to me, this thing that does happen.
Thank you, Frank. Any more like you in Kansas? So I think...
Not the governor.
So other thoughts on where we think we are right now and next moves?
I think we need to shut down the breeding grounds, the private male schools, like Canisius High School, you know, the private, because that's where classism starts. And I really think that this is about classism, and then it ends up becoming about racism and, you know, gender inequality. But if you shut down those places and you make this an egalitarian society, and it's up to women to say, I am not going to send my child to a private school where they're going to be treated better than anyone else, and have those options, because that's where you make those connections to get into the corporations. So, you know, it's all the good old boys. So I'm for shutting down the breeding ground.
Okay.
That certainly is a very revolutionary thought in itself, I think. Because the point I was going to make is women can't do this alone, much as it sounds like old thinking. Men will have to participate to change. And maybe that's where educating those young boys and men comes in. So I would, instead of shutting them down, think, how can we educate them better and have these discussions for the men, and I even think for the young women in schools. Do we have this in their curriculum, talking about history? This is many years ago when I took my daughter to the library for Women's History Month, and we picked up a book about 100 women of... She had never heard of Jackie Kennedy, and I was shocked, like, she doesn't know who Jackie Kennedy is, and then I thought, well, she didn't grow up with it. How would she know? So I think this movement, the young women in schools and the young men in schools need to be made aware and taught. Maybe that'll help.
I think just to comment on that, like, I think one of the things that we've seen in the last 20 years is this pervasive attack on sex education in public schools. And how are you going to know what a good, healthy sexual encounter looks like if you don't know what a sexual encounter looks like in the first place? And so not only do we need evidence-based and science-based sex ed in schools, but we need to broaden that to think about gender power relations and to think about representing people that aren't going to have heterosexual interactions, right? And so we need to think about sex education as a fundamentally civil rights and justice issue.
Yeah, and I don't think people are advocating for this revolution to occur without men. Clearly, everyone has got to be on board. Otherwise, it can't be a real full revolution, you know, because you have to get to the radical root of what's causing these issues. And you're an oncologist, and you know all about getting to the radical root of a disease. And it can't be addressed unless it's addressed collectively. So I don't, and I know that comes up a lot about, oh, let's not keep the boys out of this discussion. We're not saying keep the boys out of the discussion, but we're saying the discussion is changing, and they have to be prepared to change with it. And I think that's what's so unsettling to those that benefit directly from patriarchal privilege. It's like you're used to having that all-access backstage pass, not waiting in line, just walking right in, and all of a sudden say, you know what, now you gotta get the back of the line, wait with everybody else. And if you're used to their privilege, you don't like that, right? So this is a process and a conversation that has to happen collectively. Not to single out the men, but would any men like to comment on what we've been discussing here? On that note, yes, sir. Okay, thank you, Hill.
Thanks. My name's Ken. I just don't think it's a relevant issue whether it's a revolution or an evolution. What I think is relevant is that there's change, and the change is measurable. That's just my opinion.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I guess what I was trying to bring up was it may be up to the women to figure out how do we best involve the men and teach them and change them. They'll have to change.
Other thoughts over here on this side of the room? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what everybody's been saying, but I think we need to look at women's rights in a much broader way and include abortion rights, for example. Because if women can't even control their own bodies and make their own decisions about what they do with their own bodies, I mean, then what kind of freedom do we have? I mean, and the other thing about patriarchy is that goes way, way back to, Greek and Roman times. So to root that out, we're going to really have to do some heavy-duty work. So I just think we need to, I like the ideas about the intersectional issues. We have to unite with all oppressed people and, not just white women, who are employed and discriminated against, but also everybody else that needs freedom.
Agreed. And then the intersectional approach is really key to understanding how complex these issues are. And not only do we have to work closely with other disenfranchised groups, we really have to figure out a way to work with those who are in power, because they are the ones who are going to have to share that space one way or another, either by being moved out or agreeing that a new day has come. And they too suffer from this privilege, even though it doesn't look that way, but it does. There's cumulative damage to it. So I think the idea of thinking of this collectively is really powerful. Other thoughts? Don't be shy. Don't be silent.
I was talking to friends about a couple of things, and one of them is that...
I think your mic is off.
Yeah.
Can you turn it on?
There's a button on the bottom.
Just my loud voice.
There you have it. Oh, yeah. I was talking with a couple of friends about a couple of things that we hit on, and two of them this morning just said to me how their husbands were mansplaining. And their husbands are some of the good guys. Their husbands are pretty enlightened. But the mansplaining, I just kind of think, and we talked about this, Don, about human nature, and that there's something there that's just different between men and women. And so it's just kind of maybe organically there, but it also, of course, across the world is, there's all these patriarchal societies. So what does that say about the way that we're all designed? That's my first thought. And the second one is that, the informational piece of young people in particular, having information, education, and a chance to communicate and discuss these issues, I think, is very important. I think it's very hard to put any of that into school systems. I've worked in them for years. It's very hard. But that's a big important piece. And the other piece is that women have to stand together. Women have to stand up for each other. They have to stand next to somebody who's being talked down upon by her evil boyfriend, at the bus stop, whatever. But also women have to be speaking to some of the women who are part of the problem, in that they're in some kind of fantasy denial world. They don't think any of this is real.
Thank you. And I know that comes up quite a bit when I hear things like, women have to work together, or women are their worst enemies. I think it's important for us all to remember that oppression is a very encompassing thing, and we internalize it on many different levels. And we all drink, the patriarchal water and breathe the patriarchal air, and it's really difficult to develop a consciousness and step outside of it. And certain women are positioned better in society to do that than others. So even if we think someone's not with us, another woman, I think, we have to greet them with open arms and spend that time figuring out where those gaps are and create those bridges. Because women as a class are oppressed on varying levels, right? And I think we all could agree. So in that respect, we all experience that.
I just think it's so crazy. Wasn't it interesting how the stories, the book, you think about the genie in the bottle, Pandora's box, Eve and the apple, all of them are women creating evil. It's all the woman's fault that did all the bad stuff. And I think it's also interesting that, you know, how much, you were just mentioning things that aren't known. You know, we've been doing the pay gap, what do you call it, awareness for several years.
That's what you call it.
And one of the years we did an unhappy hour event, talking about how unhappy we were that we're still making so much less money. And part of the event was a survey at the end, and one of the questions, which I thought was ridiculous, that the question was actually on the survey, was, are you aware that there's a pay gap? And the number of people that said no was shocking to me. And I guess that comes back to the scenario of, you know, actually the lack of awareness is surprising to me. I know that I read a lot about this kind of stuff, but it is surprising to me when you do come across people, especially women, because there was mostly women at the event, that say, I had no idea that we were getting paid less than men.
Okay. Did you have a comment, sir? In the back, I thought I saw your hand go up. No? Okay. Any other comments, observations about the book? It doesn't have to be about, is the revolution happening now? Other things that resonated with you that you might have read? I'm gonna hit you. I just want to make sure I'm not neglecting any folk. Anybody else want to? No? Okay.
I just want to say that one sentence resonated with me, and I use it all the time. Credibility is a basic survival skill. Credibility. We have to have it for ourselves and give it to other people, women and men who aren't getting it. But credibility is everything.
Thank you. We are just about to wrap up, and any final brief thoughts from our two panelists? Brief thoughts?
I did mark one of the statements that was most interesting to me, and we kind of covered it, but I just wanted to go over it again. I think it was what you were getting to, the columnist George Will, who claimed that there was only a supposed campus epidemic of rape, that when universities of feminists or liberals make victimhood a coveted status that confers privileges, victims proliferate. That specific sentence, really, I had to make note of it. I think it's the only one. It got to the core of my anger. When you're talking about anger, that got to the core of my anger, that I was just reading it like, how dare you? How dare you say that it was, first of all, a supposed, that goes back to my how many voices do there need to be. That's when Me Too is finally successful. How many female voices need to be spoken up on the same note to be able to account for actual reality and not thought of as a lie? But and then the part where he said coveted status, the victimhood of coveted status. One of the things when we talk about rape again, that people, in the past had said they want their 5 minutes of fame. That's something that irks me to my core. Who wants fame by saying they've been raped? I just thought this statement was really to the core of how dare you to me.
Okay, thank you, Sarah and Hilary, and then we'll hear from Frank.
Well, I'll keep my remarks pretty brief, but I did want to recognize that while Solnit's work kind of predates Me Too in a lot of ways, that like Me Too was actually founded by an African American woman who was left off of the Time magazine cover of the Me Too issue. And so I just wanted to briefly recognize Tarana Burke for all of her work and really starting this. And so I think that we as white women need to always be looking for ways to make our voices heard, but also to sit back and let others speak. And just to recognize that privilege in the way that, we pretty much have focused on, Rose McGowan and a couple other like white celebrities. And so I think that feminism's work is never done, right? And part of feminism's work is looking at itself and making it more inclusive. So that's one thing that I think sometimes Solnit wasn't able to get to, but I think that's very much part of the conversation that we're having now.
Thank you, Hilary. Frank, closing thoughts.
I don't have any closing thoughts. I just wanted to just say I think that this was great. And please join me in giving Karen and our panelists a wonderful round of applause. I think it was a great discussion. May 11th, Hillbilly Elegy. I hope we'll keep the conversation going, and I hope all of you will join us in May. And once again, thank you for coming to the Chairman's Book Club. Visit the Burning Books table. Hopefully they'll come every time.
Thank you folks for coming out.
Thank you.
For your comments.